Welcome everyone. My name is Lenny Ureña Valerio. I'm the Associate Director for Program Development in the Latin American and Iberian Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today for Paul Figueroa's presentation titled Coca-Cola versus Coca-Pola, Towards a Theory of Indigenous IP Entrepreneurship.
It's a long way.
So, before I introduce Paul, I would like to take a moment to read our land acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblos Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Paul Figueroa, who is a professor at the UNM School of Law with a background in both private and public sector legal practice. He has experience as a Foreign Service officer and in-house counsel for the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, in Guatemala. Before this, he worked as an attorney advisor at USAID's Washington office, and during his career in government service, he earned multiple prestigious awards for strategic legal innovation and institutional climate. In the private sector, he managed the Customs and Trade Compliance Group at the Deloitte Consulting in Chicago, and represented foreign corporations at the U.S. Court of International Trade as a senior associate at Grunfeld Desiderio in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Paul, and welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here.
Good afternoon. How are you? Good. So this is a small group. Maybe we can introduce ourselves so I can know who you are, whether you're a student, a professor. I know a couple of you, but not everyone. Maybe we'll start with you. I know you just got here, but.
My name is Olivia, and I'm a freshman student at UNM.
Oh, okay.
My name is Elena. I'm a student.
Okay.
I'm Kayla. I'm also a student.
Great.
Michael Aguilar, also a student.
Okay.
I'm Rosa, and I work here at the LAI.
Uh-huh.
I'm Delaney, and I'm a student.
Okay.
I'm Haiti, I'm also a student.
Okay.
Kathy, Latin Studies Director.
Yes. And of course, Lenny. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank AI and Lenny for giving me the space and the opportunity to talk to you and maybe share a little bit of my research. So this is a work in progress. As some of the students may know, when you're a professor, you have two main jobs. One of them is teaching, and the other job is writing, right? Writing and doing research. So this relates to that, to my research and writing initiatives. So let me give you a little bit of background, and also I'll discuss this issue in the context of a story. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born and raised in Peru. Came to the U.S. when I was 20 years old, then studied economics, then went to law school. My ethnic background is Indigenous Peruvian and probably Spanish. So Indigenous identity. on blood ancestry more than in Latin America, right? Having said that, this topic has been in my mind for a very long time. And when I worked in Guatemala, I saw that the weavers, so in Guatemala, if you've been there, there are many indigenous communities, over 26 distinct indigenous communities with their own language and their own traditions. So they weave designs in a traditional blouse called huipil. You see the picture there, right? And at the time when I was working in Guatemala, indigenous weavers were trying to protect the designs in this huipil because local companies, international companies, were copying the designs and then selling them, right? Without really getting the permission and without giving them any really compensation, right? So that's when I started to really study this issue in depth. And I wrote an article in the context of the Guatemalan weavers who filed a case against the Guatemalan government saying basically that the Guatemalan government violated the Constitution by not protecting their cultural property. And they won that case in Guatemala. But in this second article, I plan to go a little bit broader in the Americas and then extrapolate it. I'll tell you more about it. But this article, basically, I'm going to tell you a story of, here's an outline of my talk. So I'll talk about this story in Colombia, Coca-Cola versus Coca-Pola, or Coca-Cola versus Coca-Pola. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the legal issues in protecting indigenous intellectual property and why conventional IP laws fail to protect it, and then how countries in the Americas have protected indigenous intellectual property and what lessons we can learn from that, right? So, what country is this? Colombia. So Colombia, country in Latin America, has many indigenous nations, even though it's not the country with the highest percentage of indigenous population. It has a long tradition of indigenous communities that have lived basically throughout the country, right? Colombia, if you don't know about this, has been through a pretty bloody civil war between 1985 and 2018. And it was basically a civil war between the government and the communist guerrillas that took a toll really in the country. It lasted more than 50 years. Just to give you some perspective, close to 500 people died as a result, right? So indigenous communities were caught in the middle of this. So many indigenous communities aligned themselves with the guerrillas. Other indigenous communities stayed neutral. But because indigenous communities have collective ownership of the land, they were caught in the middle. So the indigenous community I want to talk a little bit about today, they're called the Pais, Nasa Pais. And there was, so this armed conflict ended in a peace accord that pretty much stopped the violence. And it was important because as part of the peace accord, there were other reforms that benefited indigenous communities, including giving indigenous communities collective ownership of the land. Right, so that's a little bit of the context. So these indigenous communities created what I call an indigenous corporation. That's called CocaNasa. So what does this indigenous corporation do? Can somebody guess? By the name?
Produces coca products?
Yes, exactly. So CocaNasa is an indigenous corporation, and they make products derived from the coca leaf. Also, as their mission, they want to educate everyone about the benefits of coca leaf, right? So these are part of their mission. We saw the need to defend the coca leaf and wanted to break the stigma that coca is cocaine. One coca leaf for peace, one less coca leaf for war. So if you go to their website, they list the health benefits of the coca leaf, which, by the way, is not unknown to big corporations that have used coca leaf in many of traditional, in many pharmaceutical medicines, right? So they make oil, they make rum, chai, and in 2021 they came up with a product that they called CocaPola, which is beer made of coca leaf. Pola is slang in Colombia for beer. So guess who had an issue with this?
Coca-Cola.
Yeah. So this big drinks corporation took issue with Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola sent a letter to the indigenous community and basically told them, this is a copy of the letter, Spanish, and accused the indigenous community of violating the trademark, the Coca-Cola trademark, and gave the indigenous community 10 days to stop using the word Coca. So let's sit on that for a second, because the word Coca is a native word that comes from Quechua, basically from Latin America, right? And now what Coca-Cola is arguing is that they own the rights to the word Coca, right? So what did the indigenous community do? The indigenous community sent a letter back to Coca-Cola and basically asked Coca-Cola whether the company had permission to use and register the word Coca. And he gave Coca-Cola 10 days to stop using the word Coca, because the word Coca is an indigenous word that describes the plant that has been used in the Americas for centuries, right? So this ended in a stalemate because Coca-Cola quickly realized that the PR, the bad PR that we're getting out of this wasn't really worth the point that we're trying to make, right? However, this issue of corporations using indigenous designs has been going on for a while. So I can talk for hours about situations where companies have used indigenous designs without really asking for permission, right? So the question is, who owns indigenous designs, right? So maybe I'll ask you, who do you think owns indigenous designs? Can a company here
Indigenous people.
use an indigenous symbol? Or do you think the law protects indigenous intellectual property? What do you think?
Who made the laws?
Right, yeah. So, so the answer, unfortunately, is that Western IP laws don't protect indigenous designs. And that is true in the US, that's true in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. By the way, most countries have based their intellectual properties on Western IP laws that came from England, that came to the US and then spread throughout the world. So, but why is it that intellectual property doesn't protect indigenous design? So I'll give you an example, and I'm not going to get too technical, but one of the first questions you have to answer if you want to protect something, let's say under copyright law, is that who is the author, right? The question, because the protection is linked or is tied to the life of the author plus 70 years. So how does an indigenous community answer that question? Who is the author of an indigenous design? Who is the author of an indigenous song? What would they say when you ask an indigenous community who the author is? What would they say? Any idea? They would say, it's the community. There's no author. Because property, it goes to something that we call the public domain, which is, or in the context of land, is called the commons, which means that it is everybody's property. So by the way, you can use an indigenous design without any legal repercussions. There is just, the law doesn't protect indigenous intellectual property. And that is not controversial. Scholars have recognized this for a while. So they have flagged this. The disagreement between scholars is how to address the issue, how to solve this legal gap, right? And unfortunately, common law countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they are not doing a great job. In fact, the countries that have done the best job of protecting indigenous intellectual property are countries in Latin America and to a lesser extent in Africa. At the international level, understanding that this is an issue, the UN and the World Intellectual Property Organization have tried to somehow address the issue, but they have failed. So they have their declarations and conventions, which of course are not as binding. There has been more progress in protecting generic resources, but in every single respect, it's been a failure, right? So the World Intellectual Property Organization has a committee, and the committee's task was to develop an international treaty or an international agreement. Kind of like the WTO, right? Which, by the way, no one's following right now. But that would address this legal gap. So this committee was created in the year 2000, and unfortunately, they have nothing to show for it. Primarily because some countries that are part of the UN system strongly oppose an international instrument that gives right to indigenous communities over their intellectual property. What countries do you think oppose these initiatives?
Yeah.
The US, Japan.
China?
I don't know about China. Yeah,
Curious.
yeah. So, what have countries in the Americas done, right? So, countries in the Americas have adopted legal regimes that are different from the Western regimes. And I would say the gold standard or the best piece of legislation that protects indigenous intellectual property is found in Panama, Ley 20. Mexico in 2022 passed legislation that is based on For example, a sui generis regime doesn't care whether there is an individual author. You can say the community has authored this design. So it recognizes collective ownership, right? And that's a huge departure from IP laws in the West, right? These special laws coexist with Western IP laws. So as I said, the main one is in Panama. So before I started doing my research, I thought Panama was a country where you go to launder your money, but there are also amazing things in Panama, including this legislation called Ley 20 de Panama, right? And Ley 20 de Panama was a huge deal because it changed the way that people in Panama talked about indigenous intellectual property. So if you go to Panama right now and you're describing an indigenous design like this one, you can find that in the molas, which is a traditional blouse in Panama. They would say to you, oh yeah, that is the Cuna's collective property. It's funny how they talk about indigenous design has changed. They don't say, oh, that's just a design. They say that is their collective property. So the people there know this concept that, oh, this gives the indigenous community rights in perpetuity, forever. Again, that's a departure from Western IP laws that usually give you protection for a limited time. Usually, life of the author plus 70 years for copyright. So the indigenous community has ownership forever, right? So what has happened in Panama? Because a lot of the critics would say, oh, this is not possible. You cannot have two different legal regimes. Or this is not possible once the genie is out of the bottle. Basically, once everybody's using the IP, you cannot put it back in the bottle. So the Panama legislation have proven all the critics wrong. Because in just a couple of decades, the private sector, the government, and the people in general have now learned how to respect indigenous intellectual property. But not only that, if you're a company and want to use that design, what do? You go to the indigenous community, say, I want to use this design, and the indigenous community says, okay, that's good. You got to pay me a license fee. Just like if you wanted to use a private company's design, you would pay them royalties or a license to use it, right? So that is what's happening in Panama right now. So in 2022, Mexico passed similar legislation inspired by the Panama legislation. And it does the same thing in some respects, that it recognizes collective ownership. But it's pretty new, and it's still challenging to implement, because once you create this legislation, you have to create a government agency that's going to enforce it. In that state, that takes some time. So Mexico is still rolling out this new legislation, and there are some challenges. Nevertheless, this is a huge deal. So Panama legislation works well because Panama has just a few indigenous communities, only 5. Mexico has many more. It's more complex. In Panama, the indigenous communities usually are isolated and live in very set, defined areas of the country, whereas in Mexico they are dispersed, right? So there are many challenges in implementing this type of legislation in a larger country. Okay, so what am I doing with my research is I want to basically answer this question in the context of indigenous IP. What conditions enable culturally viable entrepreneurship and collaboration between indigenous communities and private companies? Basically, what sense? And there is this growing field of research called indigenous entrepreneurship that studies how entrepreneurship in indigenous communities is different from how entrepreneurship works, let's say in the West or in other settings, right? So in my article, what I want to conclude with is basically what conditions do we need to create this collaboration between indigenous communities and the private sector, right? And I would say the stars have to really align for this to work well, right? You need basically some level of self-determination and political autonomy, and that is true in Panama. That's somewhat true in Colombia, and to a lesser extent in Guatemala. Then you need a sui generis legal regime. That is, you need laws that are different from the Western model that better protect indigenous designs and indigenous intellectual property. You need a government that enforces the new legislation. So Ley 20 carries with it criminal and civil penalties if companies violate it or people violate it, right? And when there's a violation, the government works alongside the indigenous community in enforcing the law. So the government, in the context of Panama, has become an ally of the indigenous communities that want to enforce that new sui generis legislation. And the role of the private sector, right? So the private sector has to basically educate itself to learn about how to use intellectual property in a in a way that culturally respects the indigenous communities, right? So you are seeing now some collaborations between the private sector and indigenous communities. So this is Converse that launched a line of sneakers with designs from indigenous artists. This is a partnership in Panama where the purpose of the company is to, what they call it, fashion with purpose, but they basically are paying the indigenous community a license fee to use their designs, and they've created entire product lines featuring those designs, right? So, what are some of the challenges, right? And then maybe we'll open this up for questions. So, there are some challenges when you create this new legislation that gives collective ownership. Because if you are a weaver that is used to acting individually, basically weaving and then selling your product to individual companies, you're going to have to, as the weaver, as part of the community, you're going to have to go through the community, right? So that is pretty difficult to do. Once people are used to acting individually to then act collectively. Then there are gender issues because a lot of the weavers are women, a lot of the indigenous authorities are men. So if you're a weaver, would you go through the indigenous authorities? Will they represent your interests, right? Just to name it, so I'll stop there in terms of the challenges. Okay, so what is really, in my view, upsetting is this idea that when there are opportunities to collaborate, corporations are still not doing it. And I think it's a lost opportunity. I think there's a win-win here. So Nike, for example, used design from the modas in Panama without their permission. They designed these sneakers. They were about to launch the sneakers. And the Kunas wrote them a letter saying, wait a minute, you are using our designs. And they offered to collaborate, right? But what did Nike do? Because they were so embarrassed by this, what was their response? They completely canceled the launch of the sneakers. Again, a precious opportunity to collaborate. Because indigenous community, the Kunas were ready to collaborate. And in my view, that is the coolest sneaker I've ever seen. If they launch, if I could do another job besides teaching, would be that. Designing sneakers with indigenous designs from all over the world and creating, right? In creating really culturally sensitive product that benefits both indigenous communities and the private sector, right? The same, Coca-Cola could have easily collaborated with Coca-Cola. When I met with Coca-Cola, they said, we wanted to collaborate. I mean, we're tiny. I mean, Coca-Cola probably sells, what, 1,000 of those beers a year? Coca-Cola could have come in and said, okay, well, you can use our channels of distribution and we'll collaborate so you get the cost of the product plus a little profit. That would have been a win-win for Coca-Cola. They could have said, we are supporting indigenous communities. Again, that's not what it chose to do. Would have been so easy. It was a wasted opportunity. It turned out to be a PR nightmare for Coca-Cola because they couldn't really, I mean, they were accused of bullying an indigenous community, which they were doing. And now, of course, they don't want to collaborate, right? So I'll end it right there, and I'm kind of curious to hear your questions, any thoughts, anything. Yes?
So I guess what I'm curious about is the discourse that happens in indigenous tribes when they do try to engage with American companies in particular to sell their products. In the case of like Nike, you know, when you talk about that embarrassment, there's, especially for a lot of young people, a sense of obligation that when we see things like this that are being sold, is to immediately like protest, you know, shut it down, you know, speak our minds in order to, you know, get, you know, these big companies to stop appropriating culture. And so I think that's what a lot of young folks, especially in the States, see and they react to is a company appropriating a design. So then the next appropriate action is just to, you know, like protest the company and not buy the product. Yeah, and so, and you know, a lot of people here in the States are very aware of, like, especially young people and folks in marginalized identities, how capitalism hasn't necessarily improved a lot of our communities' lives. But I know that's not always the shared sentiment with like indigenous tribes who are trying to also make a living. And so I'm just kind of curious as to, you know, what maybe folks in the United States need to be aware of or should have a mind for when it comes to how we can best support indigenous communities and not maybe potentially shut down their opportunities to be able to, you know, be properly compensated and supported for their designs?
No, good question. So you're right. So corporations have generally been terrible for indigenous communities. So they've used their design, they haven't compensated them. So I think the approach to boycott is is correct, right? The question that I want to answer is that, is there a way to bridge this initiative? Oh, okay, we like this design from a corporation's perspective. Bridge that with the indigenous community saying, oh, we own it. Let's collaborate in a way that is mutually beneficial, right? So would it make you feel better if you knew that Nike, let's say, was hiring indigenous designers, was paying the indigenous community that created that design? Would that make you feel better? Yeah, I mean, you would. I think that would change the narrative, right? To some extent.
Yeah.
So I would say you're doing the right thing by boycotting. I think companies do respond to that, right? Maybe the next step would be to educate yourself. Now, Nike, after this embarrassment, recently has hired an indigenous designer from the US. And they've designed a couple sneakers incorporating her designs, right? Which I thought was a good step forward. It's still, in my view, not ideal because they're paying the individual designer instead of paying the community, right? Because the community would say, well, we own this should benefit the entire community, right? But I think there are some steps forward. So if I were a young person, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion, oh, corporation evil, and whatever they do is evil. But just look a little bit behind, right? Okay, maybe they are paying the indigenous community. And by the way, I hate corporations probably as much as you do. I've represented corporations and I know their skeletons, right? They will go to whatever expense they can to make money. However, corporations are very adaptable. If you have a legal regime that gives protection to indigenous communities, they will adapt like they have in Panama, right? Because the critics were like, oh, corporations are not going to stop using this. They've already used it for many years. No, corporations are way more adaptable than governments and than most people. They will change their practices based on market dynamics. Yes?
I love this question because it seems to me that there's an opportunity there, and I wonder if any youth movements have engaged that, right? That there's an opportunity for youth to be kind of middle people, and I'm wondering if it's happened with maybe smaller entrepreneurial efforts rather than trying to affect Nike or Coke that are such enormous corporations. But I wonder if it's not already happening as a new kind of protest engagement, but to educate yourself about where it's working, what partnerships are working, and be the ambassadors to the enterprises.
So maybe the closest to that I've seen is in Guatemala, Guatemala and indigenous communities are very well organized. So even though the Guatemalan government hasn't passed legislation that legally protects indigenous intellectual property, companies have done it voluntarily because of the pressure from indigenous communities and youth movements, weavers associations. They've said, okay, we recognize this is yours, let's try to collaborate.
But I'm hearing the question of how can we as youth do something, and I'm thinking back to my own 1980s and how youth were involved in pressuring double divestment movement, pressuring universities, and what about if the youth is the market for these products outside of Latin America, or is one important market, whether there isn't a role there?
Yeah. I mean, I think the boycotting is as good as it gets, right? Naming and shaming in social media is kind of what movements do now, right? Besides that, it's kind of, besides that, I don't see, well, I'm just thinking about the US. I don't see now a way to pressure the government to pass legislation, new legislation that protects it. That's a much harder struggle.
But can you be youth with knowledge of youth culture and youth consumerism and be like an intercultural mediator, communicator.
I mean, that's what happened with the launch of that sneaker. So Nike, after it came out that they had used the Kuna design, they were named and shamed in social media. And basically they're like, okay, we can't touch this, so let's cancel the launch, right? So,
What's your name?
Michael.
But if Michael had organized 1,000 UNM students to go and talk to Nike and say, hey, no, we love this sneaker, let's help connect you with the right people.
I think the greater problem is Nike it would cost more to pay the community than it would cost them just to pay one person. Kind of like what you said, similar is that they have one individual making traditional indigenous designs now. But that's one individual who gets paid out of thousands of people who could benefit from this. And I think the problem is if the corporation has the opportunity to take the lesser route, pay a lesser lump sum of money, they are probably going to lean towards that one, or they're just going to scrap the project and work on something that is less controversial and will make them a bigger overhead in the end.
Where's the hope?
And I think, like, to add to that, I think a lot of younger folks are trying to find a way to, like, get rid of the middleman and ask how can we, like, just directly, buy from communities instead of having to deal with Nike and costs. Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's what you could do. I think if you wanted to be the bridge, you could start an NGO that leverages indigenous IP and acts as the bridge between indigenous communities and the private sector, right? And that is that's a much tougher project, but completely doable, because what you hear sometimes, because I met with some private companies and they said, oh, we'd love to collaborate with the Kuna from Panama, but we don't have a way to reach out to them to communicate with them.
So are you going to offer a cross-listed main campus law school
Sure.
law,
Yeah.
and I'll help you recruit the undergraduates?
Yeah. I mean, that would be an amazing project, to create an entity that serves as the bridge. Because right now, indigenous communities, some of them, they don't trust corporations for good reason, right? And what you hear from the private sector is that we have challenges in communicating with indigenous communities. And there's some governance issues, right? Who represents indigenous community? In Panama, it's very easy because the Kuna have established Congress, they have legal autonomy, so they can speak for all the Kunas. In Guatemala, it's a little bit different because the Quiché live all over the country. Sometimes they don't feel represented by the Quiché authorities. And legally, they don't have the level of autonomy that the Kuna have. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And because UNM and students and all that was mentioned, I'm wondering in, like the Anderson School of Management, business programs, are these issues even discussed? Because that might start there too, because if there's no consciousness of doing that, and I know you showed the Zia symbol, I'm not quite sure if there's any, legal suits. I think there was possibly at one time, what the current status of that is. But again, just like departments of education, issues of multiculturalism and bilingualism or trilingualism, it's only maybe fairly recently, gender issues, that these things have even been discussed. So again, I'm just wondering from the academic perspective, what about in business schools? Not just UNM, obviously.
Yeah, I don't see this in the curriculum of business schools. I see it more in the curriculum of law schools. So there are now law schools that offer courses on indigenous intellectual property, on indigenous law, tribal law, etc. Right?
Yeah, but these may be people that are going to be forming corporations.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
where the issue is.
Yeah, but definitely as
I agree with you in the legal part, yeah, sure.
as educators, yeah, we can do a better job definitely in trying to raise consciousness and awareness in the universities with the courses we we teach. Business schools are a little bit, and that's the other part of the question, right? They haven't heard about this in business school, so now they are working for a corporation. Are they going to think about this issue then? Right? Probably not.
We'll invite you to Intro to Latin American Studies that we're going to advertise at the law school, at the business school.
Okay, sure.
Come in and talk
Yeah,
about it.
yeah. Well, the question is, how many of you would buy that sneaker if you knew that there was a partnership or collaboration with Indigenous people? Right? Yeah. Right? Would you? I would collect those. Those are the coolest sneakers I've ever seen, right? Yeah.
What has been the most challenging part of this research?
So I would say hearing from private sector. So I've interviewed indigenous communities and they've been very accessible, but private companies tense up as soon as you say, well, can we discuss, I know you have a little issue with this issue. Can we talk about how it was managed and maybe what we can learn about it? Or even if you spin it, how we can support you in getting this right next time. They're too embarrassed. And their reaction is, oh, sir, we can't. You can talk to them off the record, but they don't want to be cited. They don't want to be named. So that has been the most challenging. So in my research, I talk about interviews with indigenous communities, but I haven't been able to get through the And I have friends who work at Nike. I know a couple of lawyers who work for Nike. Even then, they would say, yeah. And they would tell me straight up, we're not gonna, it's too sensitive. We've been embarrassed once, so what's the reactions of not to engage on this? Which is unfortunate, because I think the only way that we are gonna bridge and leverage these opportunities is by engaging, not by disengaging. Maybe, yes.
So, yeah, I mean, you guys, if you don't ask questions, I'm just gonna. I'm curious about the Cuna because I've never thought of Panama. I mean, I know that there are indigenous communities, but I've never thought of them as having a strong role. But is it because it's such a small country that it's easier? And then what about Bolivia, where there's such indigenous strength right now? But you haven't mentioned that.
No, you're right. So, by the way, there are other countries that have very good legislation. Here's the list, right? Bolivia, Ecuador. Yeah. The issue, I think, or why the reason I haven't mentioned them is the implementation aspect of it. I think Panama has come the furthest in terms of implementation. They've created an agency within the government that enforces the new legislation. There is enforcement. You see private sector engaging with indigenous communities, right? So unfortunately, in the other countries, there is good legislation. It just hasn't been implemented fully.
And why Panama? How did that
The
come
Cuna.
about?
The Cuna, well, Panama recognized political autonomy for indigenous communities a long time ago. And the Cuna were the main the biggest indigenous community in Panama. And they were so powerful at some point that they got someone in Congress. And this person in Congress was instrumental in passing that legislation. But if you go to Panama and you go to the Cuna, you have to take your passport. So it's basically, they have full control and autonomy over their land. And it's funny, the Cuna want to collaborate with IP, right? So they're willing to basically collaborate with the private sector in terms of their indigenous designs, but they don't want to collaborate with the private sector when it comes to their land, because they feel that their land is sacred. If you go to San Blas, the beaches there are absolutely beautiful. So Marriott, Hyatt they've reached out to the Cunas and said, oh, could we build something here? Off limits, right? So I would say that's a good environment where an indigenous community can choose how to and when to collaborate, right? Anyway, it's been amazing to share my research with you. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to do more follow-up. And collaborate with the university on this. Thank you so much.